Hello and welcome back to this Down Palladios Crusade. This video is the third in my series of reread videos as I reread the entire original Hardy Boys canon book series of the 58 books. However, with the first 38 books, I'm doing a back-to-back reread with reading the revised text I grew up with, and finally directly doing a back-to-back comparison read with the original unaltered text. For those unaware, the first 38 books were rewritten and revised over a period that spanned quite a number of years. Starting in 1959, the Stratemeyer Syndicate decided it was time to update the books and remove some cultural stereotyping and other dated aspects of the original books that started with the Tower Treasure in 1927. They also did this for the Sister Nancy Drew series, meaning there are original unaltered text available for a good number of the Nancy Drew books as well. But in this process, it also meant a lot of the original flavor and texture was lost of the writings, particularly the ones by really the series creator, Leslie McFarlane, who wrote the majority of the original text editions. They also had a significant cut in page count. I've done a number of videos on my book collection of the series and talking about this issue, and you'll see more of me talking about it in the first two videos I did talking about the original and revised text comparisons. So in this, I'm going to be talking about, of course, Book 3, The Secret of the Old Mill, also from 1927, written by Leslie McFarlane again, but the revised text was not written until 1962, apparently by Alistair Hunter, who wrote a number of the revised texts. For the most part, the revised texts, it's going to be some of the same names you see turning up who wrote a number of books, but they were not written in consecutive order. It's a very much sort of hodgepodge approach. Different books were revised first. Different books had the original text stay in print for a longer time. So depending on the edition you had when you were growing up, it is quite possible for a lot of the books you actually had the original text or read the original text at some point, as I did. I know I'd read a number of them by accident in libraries and picking up copies in used bookstores and antique shops, simply trying to complete a set of Hardy Boys editions, but suddenly being very confused why the book had the same title but a different cover and different text inside. This was all, of course, before I had internet access, and then all of a sudden it was that light bulb moment. So it's now a very fascinating thing to do, to read these books back to back, which is something I've thought about, but I've just never actually done. And it's also because I didn't have all of the original text. You do have to go out and track down original copies, or older copies, I should say, because the very original first printings are true collector's items and very scarce. But thankfully, the original text for most of the books did last through some of the various printings. So as for example, with Secret of the Old Mill, you can get a later copy from the 40s or 50s or even the early 60s, and it will still have the original text. So it is thankfully out there and available if you hunt around for it. Now, Secret of the Old Mill deals with the Hardy Boys essentially going up against a counterfeiting ring that sets up shop in Bayport. The mystery is doled out very well, and but this is one of those examples of the revised text not only simply retelling the same story under the same title, but they do really graft on a secondary plot. This is where, as is usual in a lot of the revised texts, their father, Fenton Hardy, world-famous private detective, has a case of his own. This one, it is tied into a facility that's set up on the outskirts of Bayport that, of course, winds up manufacturing equipment for ballistic missiles. So it's government funded and tied into the government. And, of course, there's some skullduggery and sabotage going on, as seemingly happens in most of the cases Fenton Hardy is involved in. It's either a factory tied in with the government or some sort of government project or something. There's a good percentage of the Fenton Hardy plots having that in there. So essentially this is grafted on to the original story of the boys going up against a counterfeiting ring, and they're interwoven, and it is, as with most of the revised text plots where this happens, it is rather obvious that at some point the two cases are going to intertwine, and they'll realize that they've been working on the same case the entire time, which is part of the charm of the sort of inherent cliches you're going to run into, or not necessarily cliches, but I should say endearing sort of echoes you'll get, particularly throughout the revised text. If you're a fan of the Hardy Boys series, you'll know there are certain elements that will pop up repeatedly and become sort of cherished elements, as much as Chet Morton has a new hobby every book that somehow will tie in to helping out in the climax of solving the mystery and the last final action set piece, as it does here in the revised text of Old Mill. But again, it is the same basic story of the counterfeiting ring, and there is an Old Mill as referenced in the title. And you'll recognize some of the same core elements, but this is definitely a case where it's one of the books that has been relatively altered in terms of that they have literally shoved in an entire secondary plot that takes precedence in some moments and makes the original plot sort of go on the back burner. But it's not completely rewritten. It still has the main thrust of the original plot. Some of the same characters are there. Some of the set pieces are the same. It follows the same sort of plot progression, but it is significantly tweaked and changed around because, again, they have shoved in an entire secondary plot. And as usual with the revised text, the first thing that went was the character beats, the texture of the world, the fun of reading the story. And in reading the two books, you can very much tell the original text is a longer book. It takes its time a bit more. Some might say maybe the original text of Old Mill meanders a little bit, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does have a more leisurely pace to it, where especially when you compare it to the revised text, which is just plot point after action beat and little cliffhanger at the end of every chapter. It maximizes on the inherent chapter cliffhangers and things in the original text, because in the revised text the mandate was it has to have a smaller page count, the pace has to be a lot quicker, it has to be much more direct, but that was unfortunately at the expense of really getting invested and feeling like the world was more lived in. So the revised text has a much greater pace to it, as do all the revised texts. And that's, again, not necessarily a bad thing. It reads differently. It feels differently. And when you read the two books back to back, you can recognize it is the same basic plot, and a lot of the incidents and basic plot structure is the same. Right down to the character of the messenger boy that sort of leads the Hardys deeper into the mystery and how they get to the Old Mill, and the fact that there is an actual Old Mill that is the central location of the actual plot. Again, the major differences are in the secondary plot that's sort of shoved in and grafted into the original story when you're looking at the revised text. And another thing is one of the big things that went out of the original text when they were rewritten is any sort of anti-authority tendencies the boys had. The original text, they're much more two-fisted. It's much grittier. They're a bit more sarcastic, as are all of their friends. It feels a bit more realistic, whereas in the revised text, it is very much set in that 1950s and early 60s. I hate to use a phrase as simplistic as, everything is perfect and great on the home front, and we don't have any. They just don't feel as grounded in that sense when you look at them very closely. But they weren't designed to be looked at that way in the revised text, and they move at such a quicker pace that is part of what goes on the back burner. But when you read the original text on one of these, where it is mostly the same plot, it really underlines the qualities that Leslie McFarlane put in the books that he wrote, and that greater sense of the reader being able to identify with the characters in the world and get more fully invested. That is a very important quality that was unfortunately lost. And I think it is most felt in the climax of this book when you're looking at Old Mill in particular, because they get to a point where they, of course, infiltrate the Old Mill at night, and they're obviously going up against a counterfeiting ring who obviously doesn't want to be caught. So there is a definitely a danger factor there, but In the revised text, it is a sort of protracted affair, and they wind up going in and out of the mill, and there are confrontations. But in the original text, it is an incredible suspense set piece, because they are trying to not be discovered and trying to eavesdrop, and under fear of, if they're caught, they're probably going to get killed. But you feel it intensely. It is a extremely well written sequence. It's the best part of the entire book, I think. And McFarlane could really pull a nice bit of suspense out when it was necessary. And again, it's the most intensive part of both versions of Secret of the Old Mill, and it is nowhere to be found in the revised text in terms of the level of suspense that generates in terms of trying to not be discovered. It's a little bit of a nail biter sequence. It's really well done, and I think that is the biggest example of the difference between the writing styles of the two books. And again, I grew up with the revised text, and there's nothing wrong with it at all. Alistair Hunter was one of the stronger writers of the revised text. And in both cases, because it is book 3, it does have a little bit of that flavor of the first two books, in that it's still sort of setting up the world of the Hardy Boys a little bit. It is still only the third book, but you get that a lot more in the original text, because the revised text, again, wasn't written until 1962, after they had already done a couple of the revised books. But because the core of the plot is still from the original book, there's a little degree of that. So I'd say the first 5 Hardy Boys books have some degree of this, because they sort of set up everything, and you'll get this with any book series with the first couple books. But the first 3 have a greater degree of that, and the first 2 especially have the most. But there's still quite a bit of that in Old Mill, I think. So when you're comparing the two texts, as with most of these, it's really difficult, if not impossible, in most cases, to declare one is better than the other in terms of the overall experience. I think they're both important, and it's also harder for me because I grew up with the revised text, and I've read it hundreds of times, so it's pretty much ingrained in my head. But it's an eye-opener to then read the original text, where all of the additional plot material is not there. It's got a longer page count, it's got more room to breathe, and things play out a little differently. Another interesting bit that I found was right in the beginning, because essentially how they discover the counterfeit money that's flooding their hometown of Bayport. In the revised text, it's Chet Morton, their longtime chum, who is much more sarcastic and three-dimensional in the original text. In the revised text, he is, in the original text, he is a bit of comic relief in terms of he's the butt of a lot of jokes, but in the revised text, it's much more one-sided, and he is much more bumbling in the revised text than he is in the original text. But he's the one who gets duped by the counterfeit money in the revised text, whereas in the original text, it's actually the Hardy Boys themselves who get duped by counterfeit money at a train station. So the setting is the same. The plot element, the plot point is the same in both, at the opening of both books, but it's how it's played out and who it happens to, and the fact that the Hardy Boys themselves in the original text make the mistake and get ripped off, and they get past counterfeit money. It gives them a bit more of a personal investment in the case as it unfolds, because it starts with them getting tricked by a counterfeit bill, and it shows that they can make mistakes, and it makes them more relatable. It's an interesting, it's a very small little difference, but I think it's actually quite key in getting you invested in the story, because it shows that the main characters are themselves human and flawed, and of course they're still technically in their teens, so of course it'd be easier to be fooled by a counterfeit bill. But it shows that the counterfeiters themselves are so good, and this money is so successful at fooling people, that right at the beginning they fool the main characters, they fool the Hardy Boys themselves. So it adds a greater degree of intensity to the story, because at the very beginning the Hardy Boys themselves are duped. So it's little things like that, in addition to the bigger elements that make the original text by McFarlane feel much more lived in, much more grounded. And of course, it's written and set in the 1920s, where there's less technology to use to help them. If they have to go somewhere, they have to, it takes a lot longer to get from A to B, even when they have a car or a motorcycle. It's a lot more difficult to do anything because it's 1927 as opposed to 1962. And again, the longer page count and the passage of time feeling different, and the prose having a much more relaxed pace, it makes it a different experience, even though it is technically the same plot, the same A plot, I should say, as what's in the revised text. So in comparing the two, if I had to make a sort of judgment, because this is only a book that has been altered by the addition of the B plot and moving some things around, it's kind of a draw. Like the first two books, most of these are going to be that way. The original text is a better written book. It is much more like a novel. I'm going to have to say this about every single book that McFarlane wrote in comparison to the revised text. There's no getting around. They are better written, but they didn't have the constraints of the revised text. So it's not exactly a fair comparison, because every author coming in and doing the revised text as a ghostwriter, they had even more constraints than McFarlane did in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and the other writers who did the other books that McFarlane didn't write. So again, it's not exactly a fair comparison. There are a few examples, I think, where you can say out and out the original text is better all the way through, but none of the revised texts are bad. So again, it's something that I think it's just going to be a matter of personal preference and opinion. There are some of the original text written by other people that kind of go off the rails a bit and are a bit weird. And so in those cases, I think the revised texts are better, but they don't have that definite weirdness factor of those other original texts written by other authors. So it's a fascinating thing to compare. It's a really, I think it's a unique thing, I think, in terms of literary studies. And of course, it's not like you're going to encounter many literature courses that are studying the children's literature series of the Stratemeyer Syndicate, because unfortunately, for most of the lifespan of these books, they have been looked down upon by the literary world and by librarians and things, which is really unfortunate, because they are such a part of popular culture, of Americana. They've been read by many generations, and they are well written and well put together, even if they do go to a formula. And the McFarlane books really are, I'll just say it, they're wonderful literature. Especially reading them now as an adult, you can really get into the spirit of the writing. They're beautifully put together, and I think every fan of the book should do this at some point with at least a few of the books, if not all of them. Read the revised and original text directly back to back, because it opens up all of the minute differences that would happen, even in books like this, where it's still the same main plot. Again, this is one of the books where they have just grafted on a B plot, moved some things around, and tightened the book because of the shorter page count, and of course the pace is dramatically increased, with a little bit of updating here and there to the early 60s. But again, each book has their strengths. I think the biggest strength of the revised text is their inherent pacing and their the actual beats of the action set pieces are a bit livelier, a bit faster, sometimes a bit more developed than some of the stuff in the original text, which on the surface is maybe a little bit more simplistic, but it is a much more grounded telling, and those books were written, like this was written in 1927. So obviously the final action climax is not going to be as elaborate as the rewrite from 1962 that also has the secondary plot with the missile base as well. Just that in and of itself, that statement shows you how much more convoluted the B plot is of the revised text. So again, I think this is one of the key important books for setting up the series. A lot of the flavor is still there because the plot is the same in the revised text in terms of the main A plot. but it doesn't quite have the full impact of the original text. Again, the level of danger isn't quite as intensive in the, I should say, in the most intensive moments, particularly the finale when the boys are in the old mill under fear of discovery. So it's a fascinating comparison. I love both books. Again, I have more experience, obviously, with the revised text because that's the version I grew up with. But again, I think this is definitely a case where it's a bit of a draw between the two because they are so similar. But this will definitely, if you read both versions of this book back to back, it will definitely just to say it will underline so vividly the difference between the tone of the original text and all the material, the feeling, the texture of that world that was created that is greatly reduced or completely gone in the revised text. So again, your mileage may vary. It will be a matter of personal opinion which book you might prefer. I think both are important. I think both are essential parts of their respective original and revised canons. But it is the original text is the better written book. It is the more vivid, the more fully fleshed out, I should say, experience, whereas the revised text is much more keep the pace going, got to have another set piece, have another action beat. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's a different mindset, essentially. And that's really the case with all of these. But it hasn't been until doing this direct comparison that I could say, oh, well, this is what I liked from the original text, this is what I liked from the revised text that's unique to it, and then you can very clearly see that the main A plot is exactly the same. Now, to talk about the cover arts, because of course, like all the books, this book went through several different cover art designs. So the first cover was done by W.S. Rogers and is very much in keeping with the style and tone of all the covers he did for the early books in their first editions. Because it's a daylight setting and we have the location in the background, it does make you think of both the first two covers he did for Tower Treasure and House on the Cliff, but there is direct action going on because we have them about to jump in the river and save the boy they were following who has fallen into the river, which is one of the best action set pieces in the original text. So while it's maybe a bit simplistic, like a lot of the Rogers covers, it is giving you a direct representation of an event from the book, helping you to visualize it, and it's got more direct action than what is technically on the first two books. So it's a direct depiction of that particular scene. It's really well done. It's got a nice bit of color, and to be honest, you could actually imagine seeing this painting hanging on the wall of a museum somewhere. It's got really lovely detail, nice layout, design, and again, it's got a bit more dramatic action because it has that scene directly being depicted as the cover image. Then we jump over to the A.O. Scott second cover done in the 1940s, I believe 1944. This was in the sort of yellow spine era of the series when they would get these updated covers, mostly by Scott. This is done much in the same style of the other covers he did, where I always want to say it's a sort of slightly cartoony look to the drawings, the way the boys are rendered. It's like this on all the Scott covers that he did for the books at this time. The image is much more dynamic in terms of this is from the climax of the original text where the boys are peeking through the little crack in the wood. They're on the top, just inside the roof of the old mill in the attic sort of area, and they're eavesdropping on the counterfeiters. And this is the big suspense set piece that I was talking about in terms of the suspense moment. So I think this is, while I like the original cover, this is a much better representation, since I think this is the actual best moment of the entire book. This is the sort of image I think of anyway, because this is the cover image that Rudy Nappi was given to base his painting off of, because a good number of his paintings were actually assigned or based on some of the Scott paintings or other earlier cover editions. The publishers just wanted an updated version of that original or older painting. I also really like the level of darkness in this particular painting. this I think is the iconic image of the book of the boys in this particular moment visualized. But in the Scott painting, the background is a bit darker. It adds a bit more of a mysterious ambiance that perfectly sets up the actual book. But again, what holds it back for me and all the Scott covers is it just the sort of slightly more cartoonish looking rendering of everything. It looks a bit more obviously like a painting as opposed to what you get on the 1960 Rudy Nappy version of the Scott painting. This, I think, is the de facto standard image for the book. When you say Secret of the Old Mill, this is the image I think of automatically. I think that's the same for most people because this took over in 1960, even before the revised text. So you can't actually find copies of the original text with the Rudy Nappy artwork. This did happen for a number of the books. This is just one where it lines up. And that would also be important because this is technically something that doesn't happen in the revised text. So I remember when I was growing up, every time I would read the book, that the cover didn't exactly match any of the events of the book I was reading. Then when I finally read the original text, it's like, oh my God, that's where it comes from. Okay. So you will realize that there are some covers of the revised text that you know and love that the events being depicted don't necessarily happen. And that's because they were based on covers for the original text edition. So sometimes the covers didn't exactly line up. So this is one of those cases. As in almost every case, I think the Nappy image is the definitive cover for the book. And what he does over the Scott painting is that cartoony sort of feel is gone. There's much more of a sort of sense of photorealism. I think that was one of his strongest suits. He came out of doing many cover illustrations for the beautiful pulp paperbacks of the 50s. You can look up some of his illustrious career. Just simply do a Google image search and you'll find amazing artwork that he did for not just books but paintings as well, obviously. But I think he brought a lot of that to the Hardy Boys, even if he obviously couldn't do the same very adult-natured paintings of a pulp paperback for a children's book. But his sense of realism, the level of detail he could get into, really elevates this over the Scott painting, I think. The only difference is it's not quite as dark in terms of the background, so there's a bit more natural light, so it doesn't quite have as much of that sort of spooky atmosphere as the Scott painting, but that's really more of a minor quibble. I think this is really the image you're going to think of when you hear Secret of the Old Mill. And again, this was the cover that was used from 1960 on all the way up until Penguin did their new cover design just only a couple of years ago. So again, I think for 99% of people, this is going to be the image you think of. And then in 2016, we get to the Penguin cover, which was done by Jonathan Bartlett. It's in the same design as the others, but I think this one works better than the first two they did because it's more realistic in the color choices they used. It doesn't have pinks or purples or heavy doses of red or things. It is depicting an event from the book. It is, I think, much more in keeping with the sort of classic Hardy Boys cover style. If I had to choose the one of the Penguin covers they did that works the best, it's probably this one because it is the most straightforward. I don't think any of the Penguin covers are bad, but I just don't really think they were necessary. The internal text is the same as the previous Flashlight cover that still used the Nappy artwork, but I think there's a reason why they stopped doing these after a while because they don't have the same appeal. But I think this one is probably the most successful of the revamped covers they did. Now, to briefly mention the copies I have behind me in my own collection, for the original text I have the beautiful Applewood Books replica reprint. This is still relatively affordable. Applewood did the first 16 books in these beautiful facsimile editions that try to fully replicate the original printing that would cost you an absurd amount of money. The only difference being the rear cover information and the introduction, and of course the printed on sort of gold sticker advertising the original text. The quality of these is amazing. I think this is one of the best replica book printing series that has ever been done. They recreated the original red board hardcovers on all of these, and even replicated the original internal dust flap. The original front piece illustration is reproduced on beautiful, thick, very glossy, almost like photo paper, so the quality is through the roof. And then the original text is reproduced in the original typeface and setting as well, which is very different to what you get in the revised text. So if you've never read one of the original texts before, that's also a bit of an eye-opener. But this is about as perfect of a replica as you can get, and unfortunately they only did the first 16 books. The first 5 or so are still relatively available. You can get them for usually about $10 to $20, but after that point the scarcity really increases, and by the time you get to books 10 to 16 of the Applewood reprints, they get extremely expensive and tough to track down. So if you wanted to complete an Applewood set of 16 reprints, it's going to be a very difficult and expensive thing to do in 2022. But you still can get the first couple in really nice condition like this, and they're such beautiful replicas that I think it's really a must for collectors and fans of the series to do, because again they are so beautifully done. And my next copy is the classic tweed hardcover. This unfortunately doesn't have the dust jacket, which is pretty common because the dust jacket is the most valuable part and was unfortunately the first thing to go or get destroyed. This is a copy from sometime in the 50s or early 60s. It's a harder thing to tell without the dust jacket that lists the titles, but since this is in really good shape and it's the sort of lighter tweed where it's much sturdier and the condition is much better, I want to guess this is probably at least late 50s era. It does have the brown end papers, which indicates mid to late 50s, and this obviously would have had the dust jacket on it. It could possibly be the nappy artwork, which did go on the Tweed original text for at least a year or two before they came out with the revised text. This has a different front piece artwork that is actually drawn and printed and inked instead of the photo paper original illustration in the Applewood and very first editions. So this is still the original text. As you can see, it still has the original typeface as well. Without going for Applewood versions, the most common thing you're going to find if you're looking or trying to collect the original text is going to be the various Tweed editions, usually without the dust jacket. So if you're looking for original text, this is usually going to be one of your big choices, usually either this or one of the later picture covers that still retain the original text for a while until it had been revised. Next is the copy I had growing up. It's a little beat up, but I keep it because it was my childhood reading copy. This is the revised text picture cover with the Rudy Nappy artwork. This copy seems to be from about 1964-65 because it goes up to Aztec Warrior on the listings. It also has the white multi-scene end papers, and as you can see, somebody originally had their own homemade library card in here. There's the front illustration from the revised text. And of course, the revised text had its own unique typeface. And the other highlight of the revised text is they were filled with occasional black and white illustrations. So this is one that goes across 2 pages, but for the most part they would be single page illustrations, like so. Here is the more modern flashlight edition, still with the nappy artwork. This is the revised text. This is what you're going to find most of all in terms of looking for the Hardy Boys. The flashlights were started in the 90s, ran through, and really some are still around in print today. But this is what you'll find most of all. They have the uniform matching blue spines, and they have that sort of kind of plastic feel on to the actual finish of them. They are very sturdy. I still have great fondness for these because these were what I primarily grew up on. But the actual flashlight creeps into the art, and sometimes the various printings of these would mess with the contrast of the actual original art. So that's why it's also good to have the at least a set of the older picture covers as well for the revised text. But I still have great fondness for the flashlights. I did finally complete my flashlight set. But otherwise, they are just modern printings of the revised text. Everything's the same except, of course, the copyright page. This is a 2002 printing. The printings don't really change anything outside of the newer books. The bindings are much tighter, and sometimes the actual paper stock is a little different. Some are a bit brighter than others, but otherwise they are the same. Then, to go over quickly, this is the 1970s custom omnibus edition of the first 3 books. This has custom Rudy Nappy artwork in his style of the time in terms of the way he was designing the book covers. This is the nice bold red background. This is unique to this particular book, as is the spine, which is obviously much wider because 3 books are crammed in here. It says the revised text for Tower Treasure, House on the Cliff, and Secret of the Old Mill. Has a version of the rear cover of the picture covers because it's still the same uniform design, but the books are just pretty much presented back to back in here. So of course you get through most of the book and then you get to Old Mill. It's got a little bit of wear, but I was very happy to finally find one of these because it is much more of an uncommon book. They did occasional omnibus editions like this, but not too many. There's pretty much this one, and then the later combining the first 2 books. So this is really the only major one where the first 3 books are combined. And then here is the 2016 Penguin reprint, again with the nice firm sort of plasticky feeling hardcover as the flashlight editions, but with the new art. This has the black spine, which at least it's a uniform spine, but it still feels weird having a black spine instead of a blue spine. And the art is wraparound, although the spine kind of breaks it up, unfortunately. But again, I think this is probably the most effective of the covers they did for the first couple books. It is the most realistic looking. It doesn't have that as much as that sort of cartoony feel as the first 2. Doesn't have any crazy color, and I also really love autumn-like scenes. So the sort of red and orange background really works, I think, with this particular cover. But the actual printing inside is literally the same as what was in the flashlight edition, but the cover page has changed with this new logo, and of course the copyright page now has Penguin in 2016. So that's my thoughts on Secret of the Old Mill, plus the various editions I have in my collection. Again, the Old Mill is part of the foundation of the series, being the 3rd book, so it has a degree of what the first 2 books have in terms of setting up the world and setting the stage for what the stories are going to be. And even though it is tied to Bayport and a simpler story at its core, those are always very strong examples of Hardy Boys books. They don't always have to be the later books where they would have more of a globetrotting aspect or a more convoluted mystery. Some of the best stories in the canon are the ones that are seemingly much more straightforward and sort of hometown stories at the beginning, but of course go on to be much more than that. But Old Mill is special because it is book 3, and the revised text is still really strong because it is basically the same story, but with the B plot added of the base and knowing more of Fenton Hardy's case and the way that's woven in. I don't think it's as effective as the original text at its best moments, but it does have a quicker pace to it, and it gives it a bit more focus because it doesn't have the time or the page count to sort of meander and enjoy letting the story have a more relaxed, natural pace. So that I think is part of the key distinctions of the feeling between all the original text and all the revised text. But you can't really beat the Leslie McFarlane written original text for the boys because he basically created all of the series DNA that everybody knows and loves and grew up with, whether they read the original text or not. That is still inherent in the revised text, but the tone and the flavor of the world that he created is unique to the original text he wrote. So I think that's the key distinction. But again, this is just a very loose and informal sort of reading of what I got from reading the 2 different texts back to back. It's been an extremely fun project to get going on finally. It's something I always wanted to try and tackle, never with the idea that I would turn it into videos or articles or something, but that seems pretty much a no-brainer because it's such a fascinating comparison to make. Again, I don't think there is anything quite the same to look at in terms of printed materials and literature, of two books with the same title with two different authors written in completely different decades, some of which are completely different. So I think it's a very unique prospect to examine in terms of literature, and I think it is extremely rewarding whether you're a fan of the books or not. So again, this is just the third in my series of reread videos, and I'll hopefully return soon with my video on book 4, The Missing Chums. So until then, I hope this has been fun, at least somewhat informative. Hopefully this encourages you to maybe reread one of the books, or if you haven't read them since you were a kid, give it a try, or hopefully to read both the original and revised text back to back for yourself, because again, it is an incredible eye-opener if you haven't done it before. So as always, keep enjoying classic books, whether they're the Hardy Boys or not. Keep reading print books, keep supporting your local independent bookstores, and thanks ever so much for watching.